"Do you even know where you're standing, old man?" The remark, sharp, dismissive, and full of youthful overconfidence, cut through the steady hum inside the control tower. Airman First Class Davies, barely 20, stood with his arms folded, the image of rigid discipline mixed with obvious impatience. Beside him, Staff Sergeant Miller held a clipboard, his expression carrying a deeper, more seasoned irritation. Their focus, Frank Peterson, stayed silent. At 87, he seemed as steady and enduring as the mountains stretching beyond the wide glass windows. Wearing a plain windbreaker and slacks, he appeared completely out of place in the modern room filled with bright monitors, intricate equipment, and uniformed crews moving with purpose. Yet Frank didn't turn toward them. His eyes remained fixed on the runway below, where a line of F-35s glinted under the afternoon light. His hands rested on the window ledge, the skin thin as paper stretched over a framework of bone and veins. He stood completely still, his quiet presence clashing with the tense posture of the young airman. Miller let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly annoyed. "Sir, for the third time, this area is restricted. I need to see your authorization or I'm calling security forces. You can't just walk in here." Frank's eyes finally moved, not toward the irritated men beside him, but toward a jet rolling onto the runway. Despite their age-clouded appearance, his eyes carried a sharpness that was hard to ignore. They weren't empty. They were working, recalling. "They're so quiet now," he said softly, his voice rough. "You barely hear the engines until they're right next to you." Davies scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Look, we don't have time for a history lesson. ID now." Frank reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was aged, the edges softened, and the surface cracked like dry soil. He worked it open slowly, his fingers no longer steady. The hesitation only deepened Davies's irritation. Around them, other airmen, including controllers in the middle of their shifts, began to notice the situation. They traded quick looks, some amused, others uneasy. The tower was usually a place of absolute confidence and routine. The old man's presence felt out of place, like a loose wire creating uncertainty. "He's probably just mixed up," one airman muttered to another at his console. "Probably thinks this is the visitor center." Staff Sergeant Miller lost the last of his patience. "That's it. I'm done. Tower to command post," he said into his radio, requesting a security forces patrol. "We have an unauthorized civilian who's not complying." At that moment, Frank finally pulled out a standard state-issued driver's license and held it forward. Miller snatched it from his hand. Frank Peterson handed over the item. His address was listed as a retirement community downtown. Figures. He handed it to Davies. "Run this. See if he has any prior record for trespassing on federal property." "Sir, I was invited," Frank said, his voice steady and calm. "A reunion?" Davies laughed, louder this time. "A reunion in here? What, did you and your buddies used to play bingo around the radar screens?" The younger airman snickered. Humiliation hung in the air, thick and palpable, but Frank remained unfazed. His eyes returned to the runway, watching a fighter jet roar down the concrete and lift into the sky, the vibration rattling the glass. He followed it until it became just a speck, as if the tension around him were mere background noise. A minor distraction from the real event unfolding outside. "You don't understand," Frank said, more to the disappearing jet than anyone else. "This view, it's the same. Only the sky changes." Miller stepped forward, his posture commanding. He lowered his voice, trying for reason, but sounding more threatening than conciliatory. "Mr. Peterson, I don't know what you think this is," he said. "This is the nerve center of an active Air Force base. The world's most advanced aircraft are guided from these seats. What you see out there represents billions in technology and hundreds of lives that depend on us performing our duties uninterrupted." He gestured at Frank, as if he were an obstacle to be removed. The other controllers returned to their tasks, but the tension remained. Everyone was aware of the old man at the window and the two airmen closing in. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken judgment. Frank was an anomaly, a senior man in a room designed for youth, a relic among cutting-edge technology. His quiet dignity was misread as stubbornness, his nostalgic glance mistaken for confusion. As Frank returned his wallet to his pocket, a small object on his windbreaker lapel caught Davies's eye. It was a pin, no larger than a dime, made of dull, tarnished metal. The object was plain, lacking any military insignia or polished finish. It looked like something a child might stumble upon in the dirt. "What's that?" Davies asked, pointing. "Some kind of club pin," Frank replied. "Did you win it at the Senior Center Bake-Off?" Frank's hand instinctively went to the pin, his thumb brushing over its worn surface. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't anger or pain. It was something deeper, more elusive, like a shadow moving across a still lake. The sterile hum of the tower faded briefly, replaced by a sound from decades past, the scream of metal tearing apart at 30,000 feet. He felt a phantom chill, the biting cold of a high-altitude night. In his mind, the sunny airfield vanished, replaced by absolute blackness, speckled with indifferent stars. A hand rested on his shoulder, shaking. A voice crackling with static and terror through a headset he hadn't worn in 60 years whispered, "We're blind, Frank, we're blind up here. Just get us home." The memory disappeared as suddenly as it came, leaving Frank at the window, thumb still on the pin. The present surged back with Davies' sneering expression and Miller's impending call to security forces. The confrontation was reaching its climax. Seeing the security vehicle pull up at the tower, Miller felt a surge of authority. He was handling the situation by the book. He was in control. "All right, Mr. Peterson," Miller said, his voice firm. "Your visit is officially over. These men will escort you off the base." Not everyone shared his certainty. In a dimmer corner of the tower, at the supervisory console, Captain Eva Rotova observed the exchange. A career officer with 10 years of service, she had a knack for noticing inconsistencies. Initially, she felt Miller's irritation at the breach of protocol. But something about the old man held her back, not just his unusual calm, but his eyes. She had seen eyes like that before on combat veterans returning from deployment, eyes that had witnessed too much to be unsettled by a puffed-up staff sergeant. Then she noticed the pin. Small and unassuming, it still sparked a memory from a history seminar at the academy. A program barely mentioned in official records, a declassified ghost story. Meanwhile, Miller gestured. Rasta had only seconds before the security team arrived. Trusting her instincts, she rose and stepped into the small adjoining office, closing the door almost completely behind her. She ignored the usual security number. Her finger hovered over the desk phone keypad before dialing the base's command section, bypassing her entire chain of command. A risky, potentially career-ending decision. "This is Captain Rasta in the control tower," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Connect me to the wing commander's office. It's a Protocol 7 situation." Protocol 7 was rarely invoked, reserved for incidents involving distinguished visitors or potential diplomatic concerns, a code that demanded immediate attention. Within seconds, an aide responded. "There's an elderly civilian in the tower," Rasta explained quickly. "Staff Sergeant Miller is removing him. The man's name is Frank Peterson. He's wearing a pin, a small unmarked piece of metal. I believe it may be from Project Nightfall." She held her breath, awaiting a response. Silence stretched for a moment. Meanwhile, the airmen in the tower could see security entering the elevator, unaware that something else was unfolding. The call had triggered a different kind of response. Help was on the way, but it wasn't for Staff Sergeant Miller. The scene cut abruptly to a richly furnished office, walls lined with commendations and photographs of aircraft. Wing Commander Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man known for his unyielding authority, gripped a phone tightly, knuckles white. "Repeat that, Captain," he demanded, his voice low and controlled. Rasta's voice came through the speaker, clear despite its small volume. "His name is Frank Peterson, sir, and he is wearing what I believe is a Nightfall service pin." Colonel Thorne's expression shifted from stern to stunned. Color drained from his face as he sat upright, mind racing through classified annexes he had memorized. Project Nightfall. Frank Peterson. It couldn't be. All the operatives from that program were presumed gone, their names redacted, their actions sealed in vaults. "Keep him there," Captain Thorne ordered, his voice tense with an unfamiliar emotion. "Panic. Do not let your men touch him. I don't care what it takes. Stall them. I'm on my way." He slammed the phone down and called out for his aide. A young lieutenant hurried into the office. "Get me General Wallace on the line. Use the red phone. Tell his office it's a Broken Arrow priority. No, tell them it's about Frank Peterson." The aide fumbled, adjusting his crisp service jacket with jerky, nervous movements. He had never seen the colonel this rattled and stared, confused. "Go. Now," Thorne barked, The aide rushed off. The name Frank Peterson meant nothing to him, but Thorne's urgency was contagious. Something serious was unfolding. Back in the control tower, ignorance still reigned. Two armed security forces airmen stepped off the elevator, imposing an alert. Staff Sergeant Miller pointed at Frank. "That's him. He's been non-compliant since he arrived. I want him escorted to the gate and issued a formal trespass warning." Airman Davies smirked, enjoying the finality of the moment. He moved toward Frank, who remained at the window, seemingly lost in thought. "Time to go, Grandpa," Davies said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your little field trip is over. Let's not make this difficult." One of the airmen placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, intended as a firm guiding touch. In the context of public humiliation, it felt like an act of final dominance. This was the point of no return. They were treating a legend like a vagrant. Finally, Frank He lifted his head, his calm eyes meeting the young airman's. He didn't appear afraid, only disappointed. Just as the airman began to apply pressure, the elevator doors hissed open violently, startling everyone. Out strode Colonel Thorne, his expression dark, eyes blazing. He was followed by the base command chief and several high-ranking officers. Their sudden appearance silenced the background chatter in the tower. Miller and Davies snapped to attention, mouths agape. But it was the man who emerged last from the elevator who truly drew every eye. Tall and broad-shouldered, his dark blue service uniform displayed 4 silver stars on each shoulder, and his chest was covered in ribbons and medals. This was General Marcus Wallace, commander of Air Combat Command, one of the most powerful figures in the United States military. A 4-star general in a base control tower was almost unimaginable. He was someone you expected to see on television or in grainy Pentagon photos, not standing 10 feet from your workstation. The air itself seemed to thicken. The general's eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the room in a single dismissive sweep. He ignored the saluting colonel, the tense NCOs, and the armed security. His gaze fixed on one person alone, the frail elderly man in the windbreaker. Without a word, General Wallace crossed the floor, his polished shoes silent. The room held its collective breath. He passed Miller and Davies as if they were part of the furniture, stopping directly in front of Frank Peterson. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the 4-star general and the overlooked civilian. Then, in a gesture that defied protocol and stunned onlookers, General Wallace brought his heels together with a sharp click. He raised his right hand to his brow in a salute so precise it seemed to cut the air. His arm remained rigid, his gaze locked on Peterson. The silence stretched on. Davies looked as if he might faint, while Miller's face turned a pale green. Finally, the general spoke, his voice a commanding baritone that filled the room with undeniable authority. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone rich with genuine respect, "it is an honor." "Sir?" He held the salute a moment longer, every detail exact, before lowering it. He paused briefly before slowly lowering his hand. Then, turning his head slightly, he addressed the anxious airman in the room, though his words were clearly meant as a tribute to Frank. For those unfamiliar, the general's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "You are in the presence of a ghost," he said, "a man whose identity was classified for 50 years. You are standing before Frank Peterson, the lead mission controller for Project Nightfall at the height of the Cold War." He gestured toward the wide expanse of sky beyond the window. From a concrete bunker buried 1,000 feet underground, without the modern technology you take for granted today, this man was the eyes and ears for some of the most daring reconnaissance missions in our nation's history. He and his team guided pilots through enemy territory, alone, hunted, and in total darkness. The general's gaze fell on the small, tarnished pin on Frank's lapel. "You see this pin?" he asked, lowering his voice, making it personal. "In 1968, an SR-71 spy plane suffered a catastrophic systems failure over hostile airspace. Navigation, communications, everything failed. They were flying blind at 80,000 feet, a plane waiting to be shot down, but they weren't alone." Turning back to Frank, the general continued, using nothing more than a slide rule, a stopwatch, and his encyclopedic knowledge of the stars. He guided that pilot and his reconnaissance officer home for 3 hours. He was their compass, their radio, their guardian angel. From memory, he plotted a course across 3 borders, bringing them to a friendly airstrip with their fuel tanks nearly empty. The pilot gave him this pin, his squadron pin, because Frank had earned it more than anyone else. The room fell into stunned silence. The airman, who had minutes before seen a frail, confused old man, now saw a giant. Davis's sneer vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of disbelief. Captain Rusta felt a tear trace her cheek. She realized she had been right all along. She had been in the presence of greatness and nearly failed to recognize it. Frank simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of a memory that was his alone. General Wallace's warm, respectful expression disappeared as his gaze turned toward Miller and Davies. The room seemed to chill. His voice no longer boomed, it cut like ice. "You," he said, locking eyes on Staff Sergeant Miller, "stand in a room built on the legacy of men like him. You operate equipment that exists because of the risks they took. You saw a living piece of that history and treated him like a trespasser." He then fixed his gaze on Davies. "And you saw a hero and mocked him. Your lack of awareness is an embarrassment. Your lack of respect is a disgrace to that uniform." He did not raise his voice. The quiet fury was more terrifying than any shouting could be. "Colonel Thorne," the general said without looking away from the two stricken airmen, "I want these two in my office at 0800 tomorrow. Their careers in my Air Force are over. They can find another line of work, one that doesn't demand judgment or honor." The two men seemed to shrink under the weight of the general's words. Frank Peterson stepped forward, placing a frail hand on the general's perfectly starched sleeve. "General," Frank said, his voice soft but steady. "They're young. They've been trained to see the world in black and white, friend or foe, authorized or unauthorized. The Air Force today is different, safer in some ways, stricter in others. Don't ruin their lives over an old man's sentimentality." His grace was more striking than the general's rebuke. Frank was defending the very men who had just humiliated him. "The most important thing," Frank continued, locking eyes with Davis, "isn't the rank on your sleeve, but the history you carry. Respect the mission, son, but respect the men who came before you even more." As Frank spoke, the scene shimmered. The modern control tower faded, replaced by a cramped room from decades past, dimly lit by the green glow of primitive radar screens. A younger Frank Peterson, worn and exhausted, leaned over a console, speaking calmly into a headset. On the other end, a panicked voice shouted about instrument failure and being lost in darkness. Hours later, in a debriefing room, a pale and shaken pilot, not much older than Davis, gripped Frank's hand. He unpinned a small metal insignia from his flight suit and pressed it into Frank's palm. "You were our eyes when we were blind," the pilot whispered, voice choked with emotion. "You brought us home." The fallout from that afternoon was swift. Frank's plea saved Miller and Davis from discharge, but their careers were forever changed. They were reassigned to the most remote and undesirable posts, with duties that involved minimal human contact. More importantly, General Wallace kept his word. He introduced a base-wide heritage program. The first mandatory lesson for every new airman was now the story of Frank Peterson and Project Nightfall. A plaque at the control tower entrance bore his name and a declassified summary of his service. The tower became a monument. Weeks later, Frank sat in his usual diner booth near his retirement home watching traffic pass. The door chimed and a young man in civilian clothes entered, looking around nervously. It was former Airman First Class Davis. His posture was hesitant, his former arrogance replaced by deep humility. "Mr. Peterson," he said quietly. Frank looked up and smiled. "Son, sit down." Davy slid into the booth. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Sorry isn't enough. The way I treated you, there's no excuse." Frank nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. He didn't lecture or say, "I told you so." Instead, he asked, "Why did you join the Air Force, son?" The question caught Davis off guard. He stammered, then spoke about wanting to work with technology to serve his country. Frank listened patiently. When Davis finished, Frank gazed out the window, his eyes distant like they had been in the tower. "It's a good job," Frank said softly. "Remember, machines change, missions change, but the person sitting next to you and the people who came before you, that never changes. That's the part you have to honor." It was a quiet moment of forgiveness, a final lesson from an old teacher to a young student. The past had reached out to teach the present humility and respect. The quiet heroes among us carry stories we can all learn from. If Frank Peterson's story of dignity and grace inspired you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes.